In your wallet right now, there's a piece of paper you trust completely. You trade hours of your life for it. You exchange it for food, shelter, the necessities of survival. But what is it really? Strip away the printing, the watermarks, the solemn promises from central banks, and you're left with something profound and unsettling, a shared hallucination. Money only works because we all agree to believe in it. And in 2008, in a country in southern Africa, that collective belief didn't just weaken it, shattered completely. A loaf of bread cost $1.6 trillion. The next day, it cost more. This is the story of what happens when money loses all meaning, when the most fundamental fiction of civilization collapses, and when an entire population must navigate a world where value itself becomes impossible to measure. The $100 trillion note is real. You can hold it in your hand. It was printed by the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, a legitimate government institution, with all the security features and official seals you'd expect from any currency. Today, you can buy one on eBay for about $5. It's worth more as a curiosity, as a collector's item, as a meme, than it ever was as actual money. This paradox, this absurd inversion, where the highest denomination currency ever printed, is now worth less than the paper it's printed in ISK, which is a quirk of history. It's a window into something much deeper about human psychology, about trust, about the fragile architecture of belief that underlies every economic system that has ever existed. To understand how Zimbabwe arrived at this point, we need to step back and ask a question that seems almost childishly simple. What is money? Not the economic textbook answer about medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. Those are functions, not explanations. What is money in terms of human psychology, human behavior, the actual mechanics of how our minds work? The story we tell ourselves about money usually begins with barter. In the beginning, the story goes, people traded goods, directly chickens for grain, pottery for cloth. But this was inefficient. You needed what economists call a double coincidence of wants. So humanity invented money as a solution, as a universal intermediary that made exchange easier. It's a clean story. It makes sense. And according to anthropologists who've actually studied human societies, it's almost entirely false. Anthropologist David Graeber spent years examining the actual historical record, and what he found was striking. Barter economies, the kind where strangers meet in a marketplace and directly exchange goods, basically don't exist and never did. Except in very specific circumstances, usually when a monetary economy has collapsed and people are reverting to older patterns. What came before money wasn't barter. It was debt. It was social relationships. It was intricate systems of obligation and reciprocity where people kept track of who owed what to whom, not through formal accounting, but through memory, through social pressure, through the bonds of community. The earliest forms of what we might recognize as money weren't invented to make trade easier. They were invented to measure debt, to quantify social obligations that had previously been informal. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. Some of the oldest written records we have aren't poetry or mythology. They're accounting. They're records of debts, of grain owed to temples, of obligations between parties. Money emerged not from the marketplace, but from the need to formalize and standardize what had previously been personal relationships of mutual obligation. Consider the Yap Islanders of Micronesia and their famous stone money, the Rye stones. These are massive limestone discs, some of them 12 feet across, weighing thousands of pounds, carved from quarries on distant islands and transported by canoe across dangerous ocean waters. They're far too heavy to move regularly, so the Rye stones sit where they are, sometimes for generations, and ownership changes without the stones ever moving. Even more remarkable, there's a famous stone that fell into the ocean during transport and sank to the bottom. Everyone on the island knew the stone existed, knew who owned it, and it continued to function as money, even though no one could see it or touch it. The stone's value persisted purely as a shared agreement, a collective memory, a story the islanders told themselves about what was real. This is what money actually is. It's a story. It's a collective fiction that we all agree to participate in. In prisons, cigarettes become money. Among soldiers in war zones, ration tins or ammunition become currency. The specific object doesn't matter. What matters is that everyone agrees that this thing has value, that it can be exchanged, that it represents something beyond its physical properties. Money is shared intentionality, the uniquely human ability to create social realities through collective belief. Think about what happens when you accept payment for your work. You're trading hours of your life, your expertise, your effort, for pieces of paper or digital numbers in an account. You do this because you trust that when you want to exchange those pieces of paper or those numbers for food or shelter or anything else, other people will accept them. They'll accept them because they trust that still other people will accept them in turn. It's trust cascading through society, an intricate web of mutual belief. Money is psychology made tangible. It's an elaborate game of, let's pretend that we all play together, and it only works as long as everyone keeps playing. But what happens when people stop believing? When the collective fiction begins to crack? History provides answers, and they're not gentle ones. In the winter of 1923, in the German Weimar Republic, Hyperinflation reached the point where prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day because by evening their morning wages would buy almost nothing. Wives would meet their husbands at factory gates during lunch breaks to rush to shops and spend the money before it lost more value. Wheelbarrows full of cash became a common sight. There are photographs of children playing with bricks of banknotes, using them as building blocks because they were cheaper than toys. This wasn't gradual economic decline. This was reality itself becoming untethered. The basic assumptions about value dissolving in real time. In Hungary in 1946, the hyperinflation was even more extreme. The peng lost value so rapidly that the government had to introduce a new unit called the Adopeng, specifically for calculating taxes, because the regular peng was changing too fast for the tax system to function. At the peak, prices doubled approximately every 15 hours. The largest denomination note ever printed anywhere was the Hungarian 100 million billion peng one, with 20 zeros after it. It bought about one person's daily groceries. In Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, monthly inflation reached 300 million%. In revolutionary America, the continental currency collapsed so completely that "not worth a continental" became a lasting phrase in American English. These aren't ancient history or exotic aberrations. These are examples of what happens when the confidence game that underlies all monetary systems breaks down. The psychology is consistent across cases. There's a tipping point, a moment when skepticism becomes contagion. People notice other people losing faith. They see neighbors rushing to convert currency to goods, to anything tangible. This observation triggers their own anxiety. Social proof, the psychological tendency to look to others for cues about how to behave, amplifies the crisis. Bank runs happen not because banks actually run out of money, but because people believe they might, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling as everyone tries to withdraw at once. Monetary collapse is a kind of mass cognitive shift, like those optical illusions where you see either two faces or a vase. But once you've seen both, you can never fully unsee either possibility. Once people entertain the thought that their currency might become worthless, that thought alone can make it so. Monetary systems are stable until they're not. There's a normalcy bias that protects them, a cognitive tendency to believe that things will continue as they have been, that the future will resemble the recent past. This bias is protective most of the time. It prevents panic over routine fluctuations. But it also means that when systems do break down, people are psychologically unprepared. They've built their entire understanding of value, of planning, of future security, on assumptions that turn out to be contingent, fragile, subject to collapse. So what causes that shift? In Zimbabwe, it began not with economics in the abstract, but with land, with legacy, with the unresolved tensions of colonialism, and the specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, it was called the breadbasket of Africa, the country that had been Rhodesia, that had fought a brutal 15-year liberation war, emerged with Robert Mugabe as prime minister and later president. The initial signs were promising. Mugabe spoke of reconciliation, of moving forward together, of building a new nation. The economy was relatively strong. Agricultural output was high, particularly in tobacco and maize. But beneath this surface, tensions remained unresolved. The colonial legacy was stark. Approximately 70% of the country's most productive arable land was owned by less than 1% of the population. Predominantly white commercial farmers, whose families had received land grants during the Rhodesian era, this wasn't ancient history. These were recent wounds. The Lancaster House Agreement that had facilitated independence included a 10-year moratorium on land reform, a compromise that postponed, rather than resolved, the fundamental question of land redistribution. For a while, this worked. The government bought some land through willing seller, willing buyer arrangements. Growth continued, but the underlying inequity remained, a tension waiting for the right conditions to explode. The first serious warning signs appeared in the mid to late 1990s. In 1997, Mugabe announced an unbudgeted payment of $450 million to war veterans, people who had fought in the liberation struggle and now represented a politically important constituency. The money wasn't there. The government essentially printed it. On November 14, 1997, the Zimbabwean dollar dropped 71% in a single day. It was called Black Friday. The currency had been trading at around 12 to the US dollar. By the end of the day, it was over 20. This should have been a decisive signal, a clear indication that fiscal discipline mattered, that you couldn't simply create money without economic backing. Instead, the lesson learned by the government was different. They had faced political pressure from an important group, and they had responded by printing money. The currency had fallen, but the government survived. The veterans were placated. The political crisis was averted. In hindsight, this was the beginning of a pattern using monetary expansion as a solution to political problems, prioritizing short-term political survival over long-term economic stability. Then came the Congo War. In 1998, Zimbabwe committed troops to the Democratic Republic of Congo, ostensibly to support the government against rebel groups. The real motivations were murkier mineral rights, regional influence, opportunities for connected individuals to profit from resource extraction. What's clear is that the deployment was expensive, costing hundreds of millions of dollars that Zimbabwe didn't have, with no clear revenue stream to pay for it. Again, the solution was the printing press. The real trigger came in February 2000. Mugabe held a constitutional referendum that included, among other provisions, protection from prosecution for government officials and expanded presidential powers. The referendum failed. It was the first significant electoral defeat Mugabe had experienced. His response was telling. Within weeks, supposedly spontaneous land invasions began. Groups of war veterans, backed by government rhetoric, if not always direct orders, began occupying white-owned commercial farms. What followed was called fast-track land reform. The seizures were often violent. Farmers were forced off land their families had worked for generations, sometimes killed. Property was destroyed. There was minimal compensation. The stated goal was to redistribute land to landless black Zimbabweans, to correct the historical injustice of colonial land theft. The reality was more chaotic. Much of the seized land went not to poor farmers, but to political elites, to army officers, to people connected to the ruling party. Even land that did go to ordinary people often went to individuals without farming experience, without capital for equipment or inputs, without the infrastructure that commercial farming requires. Agricultural output collapsed. Zimbabwe had exported tobacco, maize, and other crops. Those exports dried up. Tobacco production fell by more than 60%. Food security evaporated. A country that had fed itself and exported surplus began needing food aid. The international community responded with sanctions, not comprehensive sanctions on all trade, but targeted sanctions on specific government officials and entities, combined with a broader withdrawal of investment and economic engagement. The brain drain accelerated. Skilled professionals, white and black alike, left for South Africa, for the UK, for anywhere that offered stability and opportunity. Here's where the psychology becomes critical. The rational economic response to collapsing productivity would have been to stabilize what remained, to cut government spending, to seek international assistance in exchange for reforms. But Mugabe's government faced a different calculation. Admitting the failure of land reform would be political suicide. It would mean acknowledging that the core policy, the policy justified by appeals to historical justice and anti-colonial struggle, had been catastrophically mismanaged. So instead, they doubled down. Gideon Gono was appointed governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe in 2003. He was a sophisticated financial professional who understood monetary policy, and he faced an impossible situation. The government needed money to pay for basic function salaries for civil servants, for the military, for operations. Tax revenue was collapsing along with the economy. Foreign borrowing wasn't an option given sanctions and lack of creditworthiness. So Gono did what the government demanded. He printed money. What makes this fascinating from a psychological perspective is that Gono wasn't ignorant. He knew the basic economics. He knew that printing money without corresponding economic production causes inflation, but he rationalized it. He talked about printing money for dignity, about maintaining sovereignty, about not bowing to Western demands for reform. There's a cognitive pattern here: motivated reasoning, where the conclusion is predetermined and the mind works backwards to construct justifications. The political necessity of maintaining the government overrode economic reality, and the central bank's role shifted from managing the currency to funding the state. The pattern, once established, accelerated. In 1998, inflation was 32% annually high, but manageable. By 2001, it was 132%. By 2003, 624%. These are still technically numbers that economies can survive. Painful, destructive, but survivable. But then the acceleration became exponential. 2006, 1,281%. The government's response was to redenominate the currency, to drop 3 zeros. 1,000 old dollars became 1 new dollar. This is supposed to make calculations easier, to restore confidence. It did neither. By 2007, inflation was in the thousands of percent annually. By 2008, it was unmeasurable. In conventional terms, estimates range from millions to billions of percent, depending on methodology. The government stopped publishing inflation statistics entirely. Prices changed not daily, but hourly. The currency redenomination happened again, and again dropped 3 zeros, then dropped 10 zeros, then dropped 13 zeros. Bearer checks replaced formal currency. The $100 trillion note was printed, and through it all, ordinary people had to navigate a world where the basic tool of economic life, the measuring stick of value itself, had become meaningless. Imagine trying to plan a week ahead when you don't know what prices will be tomorrow. Imagine receiving your salary in the morning and knowing that by afternoon it will buy half as much. Imagine saving for years, only to watch those savings evaporate in weeks. This isn't just economic hardship, this is cognitive chaos. The human brain evolved to recognize patterns, to predict, to plan. We're profoundly oriented toward the future. We sacrifice present comfort for future reward. We build careers over decades, save for retirement, make investments that pay off years later. All of this requires a stable framework for measuring value across time. Hyperinflation destroys that framework. It's not just that you're poorer, it's that the concept of wealth itself becomes incoherent. Psychologists talk about mental accounting, the cognitive systems we use to track and categorize money, to budget, to make trade-offs. In hyperinflation, mental accounting collapses. You can't track value when value is in constant flux. The anchors we use for price judgments, what's expensive versus cheap, what's a good deal versus a ripoff, these stop functioning. $1 million might have bought groceries yesterday. Today, it buys a single egg. The number itself loses meaning. Time perception shifts in profound ways. Behavioral economists have documented present bias, the tendency to overweight immediate rewards versus future ones. Hyperinflation amplifies this to an extreme. Future planning becomes literally impossible. You must spend money immediately or watch it lose value. This creates a forced urgency, a compression of time horizons. People stop thinking in terms of months or years, they think in terms of hours. Receive payment, spend it now, before afternoon prices rise again. There's a philosophical dimension here that's easy to miss in the chaos of day-to-day survival. The Enlightenment promised rational economic actors making informed decisions in stable markets. The entire edifice of modern economics rests on assumptions about calculable value, measurable utility, comparable options. Hyperinflation reveals these as contingent, fragile constructs that depend on stable currency. When that stability evaporates, we see what human economic behavior actually looks like in conditions of radical uncertainty, not rational optimization, but desperate improvisation. Nietzsche wrote about the transvaluation of values, the overturning of established moral frameworks. In hyperinflation, this becomes literal. The values themselves, the numerical assignments that measure worth, undergo constant transvaluation. Nothing holds steady. the abstraction that civilization relies on to coordinate activity across millions of people-stable units of value simply ceases to function. The behavioral adaptations were remarkable in their creativity and tragic in their necessity. Multiple parallel economies emerged organically. The Zimbabwean dollar continued to exist officially, but no one trusted it for anything beyond immediate transactions. US dollars circulated, hoarded, became the real currency for anything important. South African rand crossed the border. Barter networks formed where people traded goods directly, returning to patterns that predated money itself. IOs and personal promissory notes became common. Essentially, people creating their own private currencies based on individual trust relationships. There was a morning rush to shops because prices would rise by afternoon. Salaries became meaningless as a monthly concept. Workers negotiated daily payments or demanded payment in kind: food, goods, anything tangible that would hold value. The rush to real assets became overwhelming. If you had cash, you immediately converted it to something physical. Cars, even broken cars, because cars held value, property, livestock, anything that couldn't be printed into worthlessness. The parallels to Weimar Germany were striking. The same psychological patterns, separated by 80 years and thousands of miles. Workers paid twice daily, the rush to spend before value evaporated, wheelbarrows of cash, the surreal images of worthlessness: children playing with money. People wallpapering walls with banknotes because the notes were cheaper than wallpaper. Human psychology under these conditions follows predictable patterns. When the future becomes unknowable, when value becomes unmeasurable, people revert to immediate tangibility, to social networks of trust, to survival modes that bypass the broken formal economy entirely. But the real devastation was social, not just economic. Money is more than a measuring tool. It's the infrastructure of trust that holds complex societies together. When that infrastructure fails, the social fabric unravels. Consider the employer-employee relationship. It's based on a deferred exchange: you work now, you get paid later, and that payment retains enough value to make the work worthwhile. In hyperinflation, this breaks down. A teacher might receive $700 billion monthly salary. It buys 2 loaves of bread. The implicit social contract work for livelihood becomes a mockery. People kept working, but the meaning changed. Work became more about maintaining social position, about having somewhere to be, about preserving dignity, than about the actual compensation. Savings destroyed is more than an economic fact. It's a betrayal. People who had saved carefully, who had deferred gratification for years or decades, watched their life's accumulated work become nothing. Pension funds evaporated. The elderly, who had been promised security in exchange for lifetime contributions, were left destitute. This isn't just poverty, it's the breaking of a social promise. The revelation that the system you trusted was built on nothing but collective agreement, and that agreement has ended. The middle class effectively ceased to exist. The distinction between doctor and janitor, between educated professional and unskilled laborer, collapsed. Everyone was equally poor. The social stratification that education and expertise had built over generations flattened in months. This has profound psychological effects. Status matters to human beings. We're social creatures who navigate complex hierarchies. When those hierarchies flatten catastrophically, when achievement and effort become indistinguishable from lack of achievement, the social organization that motivates behavior breaks down. Crime surged, but in complex ways. When currency is worthless, traditional theft loses meaning. What's left to steal? Hard currency, yes, US dollars, rand, foreign bills, became targets. But also goods, consumables, anything physical. Corruption optimized around this new reality. Government officials, police, anyone with discretionary power demanded bribes in hard currency or goods. The formal economy couldn't pay enough to make work worthwhile, so the informal economy of favors and bribes filled the gap. This wasn't anomalous. It was rational adaptation to broken formal institutions. The informal economy became dominant, not by choice, but by necessity. Trust networks replaced institutional frameworks. You did business with family, with people from your village, with networks of personal connection where trust was based on relationship rather than legal enforcement. Because legal enforcement had failed, contracts denominated in Zimbabwean dollars were worthless. The courts couldn't function. The entire apparatus of formal economic life contracts, wages, prices, savings, had been revealed as contingent on a currency that no longer measured anything stable. 3 million people left Zimbabwe, roughly a quarter of the population. This wasn't random immigration. It was the people with options, with education, with skills that were marketable elsewhere. Doctors, nurses, teachers, engineers, the human capital that any economy needs to function, they left. They left for South Africa primarily, but also for the UK, for Australia, for anywhere that offered stability. What remained was a population increasingly unable to maintain the infrastructure of modern life. Education collapsed because teachers couldn't afford transport to schools. The cost of getting to work exceeded the value of the salary. Schools closed, healthcare disintegrated. Hospitals ran out of supplies. They couldn't pay staff enough to show up. In 2008, a cholera outbreak killed thousands because the public health infrastructure had ceased functioning. The water treatment plants couldn't maintain operations. Infrastructure everywhere decayed because maintenance requires payment, and payment requires meaningful currency. Even tax collection failed. The government couldn't pay tax collectors enough to make collection worthwhile. The very apparatus the government had destroyed currency to fund the state itself. The salaries and operations of government began to fail because the worthless currency couldn't motivate the human beings who staffed that apparatus. There's a bitter irony running through all of this. Mugabe's land reform was justified as indigenization, as returning Zimbabwe to Zimbabweans, as correcting colonial exploitation. The outcome was universal poverty that spared no one. The land reform that was supposed to empower created famine. The Zimbabwe dollars that were supposed to represent national sovereignty became a global punchline. Mugabe remained in power, surrounded by loyalists who benefited from the chaos, while ordinary Zimbabweans suffered the consequences of policies justified in their name. The cross-cultural comparisons are instructive. The post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s showed similar patterns of institutional trust breakdown. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the institutions people had relied on state employment, pensions, the planned economy, the informal economy, barter networks, mafia protection. These filled the void. Argentina has experienced repeated currency crises through its history, and Argentine society has adapted in ways that show learning across generations, a kind of cultural muscle memory for navigating currency instability that Zimbabwe lacked. Lebanon's pound collapse from 2019 onward has followed remarkably similar patterns: political crisis, leading to economic mismanagement, leading to currency collapse, leading to social breakdown. The pattern is consistent. Monetary collapse isn't just economic, it's social, psychological, existential. It breaks the frameworks through which people understand value, plan futures, maintain relationships, organize society. In April 2009, Zimbabwe did something radical. They admitted defeat. The government suspended the Zimbabwe dollar entirely and legalized 9 foreign currencies, primarily the US dollar and the South African rand. Overnight, inflation stopped, not slowed, stopped. The simple act of abandoning their own currency and using someone else's stabilized prices immediately. Shops could plan, people could calculate, the basic infrastructure of economic life began functioning again. This solution carried its own psychological complexity. There was relief, certainly. The chaos ended. But there was also shame. The implicit admission was devastating: Zimbabwe cannot be trusted with its own money. The country had to borrow monetary credibility from elsewhere. For a nation that had fought for independence, that had endured colonialism and white minority rule, that had built its post-liberation identity around sovereignty and self-determination, this was a profound symbolic defeat. The economic philosophy question is genuine. Can a nation function without monetary sovereignty? Classical economics says no. Control of currency is fundamental to state power, to the ability to respond to economic crises, to manage trade and investment. But Zimbabwe's experience suggests a different answer. Sometimes the trust is so broken that giving up control is better than maintaining the pretense of it. Ecuador dollarized in 2000 after a banking crisis. El Salvador adopted the dollar in 2001. These weren't temporary measures. They were permanent abandonments of monetary sovereignty in exchange for stability. The trade-off is really you can't print money, can't devalue to make exports cheaper. can't use monetary policy to manage economic cycles. But you also can't inflate away the value of savings. You can't destroy trust through mismanagement. The currency question becomes, is money identity or tool? Is it a symbol of national pride or a practical instrument for exchange? For Zimbabweans, the relief of dollarization was tempered by generational trauma that remained. People who had lost savings never recovered them. Those savings were gone, converted to nothing through the previous decade. The economic stabilization didn't undo the psychological damage, the broken trust, the learned skepticism toward institutions and promises of security. In 2019, the government attempted to reintroduce a Zimbabwe dollar. The reaction was immediate skepticism. People had learned they didn't trust easily anymore. And sure enough, inflation returned. Not at 2008 levels, but enough to validate the fear, to prove that the underlying issue is political control of monetary policy, lack of fiscal discipline, inability to resist printing money for political purposes. These hadn't been resolved. The currency failed again, though not as catastrophically. The lesson was reinforced. Zimbabwe's government can't be trusted with monetary policy. But what makes Zimbabwe's story more than just a cautionary tale about one country's mismanagement. The psychological mechanisms, the patterns of behavior, the relationship between trust and monetary stability, these are universal. Every currency in the world, from the dollar to the euro to the yuan, rests on the same foundation Zimbabwe's did: collective trust. The belief that tomorrow, this piece of paper or this digital number will still be accepted as payment, will still measure value in ways that others recognize. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, every central bank manages this psychology. They don't just manage money supply, they manage expectations, confidence, belief. When they announce policy changes, they're carefully calibrating messages to shape how people think about inflation, about stability, about the future. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't hyperinflation, but it was the same underlying issue: trust in institutions collapsed. Trust that banks were solvent, that mortgages were backed by real value, that the financial system was stable. The crisis was psychological as much as economic. Quantitative easing, the policy of central banks creating money to buy assets, is printing money, just like Zimbabwe did. The difference is context, is constraint, is the institutions and checks that prevent printing from becoming uncontrolled. When is money printing responsible versus irresponsible? The answer is never purely technical. It's always about trust, about whether people believe the institution printing money has the restraint and wisdom to stop, to manage the money supply in ways that preserve value. Venezuela repeated Zimbabwe's playbook almost exactly. Political decisions leading to economic mismanagement, leading to printing money to cover deficits, leading to hyperinflation, leading to social collapse. The psychological patterns were identical: present bias, rush to hard currency, parallel economies, brain drain, institutional breakdown. Different country, different decade, same human responses to the same pressures. Lebanon's currency collapsed as political crisis prevented the government from functioning. Turkey's lira has lost dramatic value as President Erdogan has pursued unorthodox monetary policy, firing central bank governors who resist his pressure to keep interest rates low despite inflation. Sri Lanka experienced political crises that became economic crisis, that became currency crisis. The pattern repeats because the underlying psychology repeats. And then there's cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was created in 2009, the same year Zimbabwe abandoned its currency. The timing isn't coincidental. Bitcoin emerged from a loss of faith in traditional institutions, in central banks, in government control of money. It promised a trustless system. You didn't need to trust any institution because the blockchain and cryptographic proof would guarantee the integrity of the currency. It was explicitly a response to Zimbabwe-type scenarios, to the possibility that governments can't be trusted with money. But trustless systems reveal their own problems. Bitcoin is volatile, precisely because it lacks institutional backing. There's no central bank to manage supply, to smooth cycles, to provide liquidity in crises. Stablecoins emerged as a kind of compromised cryptocurrencies pegged to traditional currencies. Admitting that stability requires some anchor, some trust in something, the irony is that crypto's volatility is a different flavor of the same instability that hyperinflation represents. Instead of value eroding predictably, it swings wildly. The unit of measurement still fails to be stable. Behavioral economics provides frameworks for understanding these patterns at scale. Loss aversion. People's tendency to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains means populations cling to failing currencies too long. They don't want to accept the loss of savings, don't want to acknowledge that the system has failed. This delay makes the eventual collapse worse. Sunk cost fallacy operates at governmental level. We've already printed this much money, already committed to these policies, so we continue rather than admit failure. The availability heuristic, judging probability by how isolated examples come to mind, means people in stable countries assume it can't happen here because they have no recent examples, until it does happen, and then the recent examples multiply. The Enlightenment promise was rational economic actors making informed decisions in transparent markets. The reality is that emotion, politics, psychology drive monetary systems. Fear and greed determine asset prices more than rational valuation. Political expedience drives monetary policy more than economic optimization. Crowd psychology creates bubbles and crashes that rational models can't predict or explain. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is an extreme case, but it reveals what's true in milder form. Everywhere money is collective psychology, and psychology is not rational, not stable, not predictable. Yuval Noah Harari's insight in *Sapiens* is that humanity's unique power comes from our ability to create shared fictions, nations, corporations, legal systems, and yes, money. These fictions enable cooperation at massive scale, coordination among millions of strangers. But the flip side of this power is vulnerability. The fictions only work while people believe in them. When belief fails, the fiction collapses, and with it, the cooperative structures built on top of it. Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar note is proof that even official government currency, with all the authority and institutions behind it, is still just a fiction. And fictions can end. Today, the $100 trillion note sits in collectors' markets, in eBay listings, in tourists' purchases from Harari Street vendors. It's become kitsch, a conversation piece, a symbol of excess. The speed with which catastrophe becomes curiosity is itself revealing. The forgetting happens fast. The lessons don't transfer well across borders or generations. People in stable countries see the Zimbabwe note as evidence of uniquely bad governance, not as a warning about universal vulnerabilities. But Zimbabweans haven't forgotten. There's bitter laughter when they see the notes for sale. There's trauma in the older generation that remembers. Teachers who lost careers, professionals who lost savings, families that scattered across southern Africa and beyond. The physical note might be worth $5 as a collectible, but the psychological cost of what it represents is incalculable. The question the note forces is uncomfortable. What makes any currency different? The US dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. That's not gold, that's not tangible, that's trust. Trust that the government will remain stable, that the economy will continue functioning, that institutions will remain credible, that fiscal and monetary policy will be managed responsibly. All of these are psychological judgments about future behavior, not physical facts. The euro is backed by the collective commitment of European Union member states. That commitment is political contingent, subject to the same pressures that broke Zimbabwe's currency. The yuan is backed by the Chinese government's authority and economic management. Trust again in institutions, in competence, in restraint. Every currency is a bet on collective belief continuing. The difference between stable currencies and Zimbabwe's failed one is not in fundamental nature. It's in degree and in the quality of institutions managing that belief. Strong institutions with checks and balances, with independence from political pressure. With transparency and accountability, these can maintain the collective fiction successfully. Weak institutions, institutions subordinated to political expedience. Institutions without checks against misuse, these eventually fail. And when they fail, the psychology is the same everywhere: fear flight to tangibles, breakdown of planning, collapse of trust. History doesn't repeat exactly. Zimbabwe's specific circumstances, colonial legacy, land distribution, liberation, politics, specific leadership decisions, these were particular to place and time. But human psychology does repeat: the patterns of behavior under hyperinflation, the cognitive adaptations to chaos, the social breakdown when trust evaporates, These are consistent across cultures and eras because they reflect how human minds work under extreme conditions. The question isn't whether hyperinflation could happen elsewhere. It has happened elsewhere, repeatedly, across continents and centuries. The question is, what prevents it? And the answer is not economic laws or technical constraints. The answer is institutions and trust. Institutions strong enough to resist political pressure to print money indefinitely. Trust that those institutions will continue exercising that restraint. Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar note is a mirror. Hold it up and look carefully. You'll see not just a failed currency from a distant country, but a reflection of every monetary system's fragility. You'll see the collective fiction that makes modern life possible and the psychological mechanisms that sustain it. You'll see what happens when those mechanisms break down, when trust evaporates, when belief fails. Every bill in your wallet carries the same implicit promise that Zimbabwe's currency once carried. The promise that tomorrow it will still have value, that others will still accept it, that the social fiction will continue. That promise is only as strong as the institutions behind it and the collective belief supporting it. Zimbabwe showed us what happens when that promise breaks. The note is worth $5 today as a curiosity, as a historical artifact, as a meme. But its value as a warning about trust, about institutions, about the fragile psychology underlying every monetary system that has ever existed, that value is beyond measure. The trillion-dollar note asks us to see what we prefer not to see, that the money we trust completely is psychology made tangible. A story we tell together, and that, like all stories, it can be rewritten or forgotten. The only question is what we do with that knowledge, whether we strengthen the institutions that maintain the fiction, or whether we learn Zimbabwe's lesson the hard way, one collapsed currency at a time.